You look at every animation studio, and they started with the short film.
The mythology of Pixar goes back to the 5 guys sitting in a hallway making Luxo Jr., making Red's Dream, making Tin Toy, and constantly challenging each other.
There was a kind of pioneer spirit, like we're out in the wilderness making our own roads, and there's really nobody to help.
We were 1% of Pixar's expenditures and 99% of its visibility.
When we showed our stuff, which now I look back and think of as kind of crude, but it blew people away at the time because it was so much in advance.
It's really fun to see all the films strung together because you can see the medium evolve right before your eyes.
The development of our talents, the development of our technology leading up to the first feature film.
Trying to make a feature film in the 70s and 80s was completely nuts because the computers at the time were way too slow.
Back when we were working on our very first films, it was a challenge to make even a single image in computer graphics.
Compute power was still a huge limitation. Rendering any kind of computer graphics was just incredibly expensive.
We had a VEX 780, which is 1 million instructions per second, which is less than 1% of what you'd find in a modern PDA. The computer in a cell phone is 100 times faster than the one that we had at Lucasfilm.
So doing anything was just an incredible pain.
In those days, computer animation, computer graphics was in the domain of guys in white lab coats.
All of the images in the animation were being created by the same people who wrote the software.
Like going to a museum where all the paintings were done by the people who designed canvases and brushes.
The pictures were very simple, cartoony, kind of even primitive video game shapes.
Most of the motions had to be plotted out on graph paper, and people counted the little squares and typed in a number into the computer and said, go here, go here, go here, go here. And sometimes that looks good, and sometimes it looks kind of robot-like.
Our long-term goal was to make an animated film. In fact, everybody in the industry knew this group was dedicated to doing that.
And we knew that in order to get there, we had to have software that was robust and powerful and scaled properly. And
so let's work on the technology and on the software, and the speed will come. When we made our first short, we based it on an idea that Allie Ray Smith came up with. And it was at that time that we went out and hired John Lasseter to come in as the animator for it.
It seems funny to say it, but officially I directed him in his first animation at Lucasfilm. It was a piece called Andre and Wally B.
Ed Catmull and Alvy Ray Smith asked me to think about what a character would look like made up of simple geometric shapes. Spheres, cones, cylinders, boxes, that kind of thing. But I started looking at how simple Ub Iwerks drew those early Mickey Mouse cartoons. And so I started drawing what became Andre as this character made of simple shapes.
Up until then, most of us nerdy types didn't know how to do soft characters, nor was the technology really capable of doing rubbery, moldable characters like a good animator needs.
I remember going to Ed and saying, boy, I would love to have something I could bend, because the body is where a cartoon character gets so much of his expression. And so he thought, in classic Ed Catmull style, let me think about this. And he went away. And he came back, and he had invented the teardrop. The bottom was a hemisphere, the top was a hemisphere. And then the computer filled in this kind of section in the middle, and it bent. And I got so inspired by this that I got the idea for the second character, which was this big bumblebee with these big jelly bean-like water balloon feet.
Basically what happened in Andre and Wally B was the team of Bill Reeves and John Lasseter got established.
Actually, the part I worked on Andre and Wally the most was the backgrounds, was the set, the trees.
Bill Reeves had delivered something called particle systems, an ability to create and control millions of individual particles to build up larger objects.
So you could make it look like there were millions of leaves out there on a hillside full of trees. It gave this richness that I wasn't used to.
It was beautiful. It was like a painting. It was like pointillism. I was working on this for a few months in the springtime of 1984. The big deadline was this computer graphics convention called SIGGRAPH.
SIGGRAPH was a very important show at the time where a lot of the industry got together.
And you would show up once a year and show off what you had done that year to all of your colleagues.
They had courses, they had panels, and they had the evening film show. And this was like a Geek Fest rock and roll concert or something, because it was always in a big arena.
It was a conference where everybody went, wow, a lot. Because every year things were new.
I remember Jim Blinn always coming every year. He was working at Jet Propulsion Lab, and he would come with planetary stuff of some form or another.
And some of the companies started off by making logos, because you could have them spin around and put sparkles and do various things to have interesting logos.
Most of it was just technology demonstrations.
You know, crystal balls over a checkerboard, and everybody went crazy. I'm sitting here going, what am I missing here? But everyone recognized the technical advances that they were seeing.
If it was a breakthrough moment, the house would come down with cheering and applause.
There's no story, there's no characters, there's nothing to engage with at all, but we know how hard that was.
And one of the techniques we wanted to show off in Andre and Wally-B, well, there's two. We wanted this animation done by a real animator to be showcased. We had the particle systems by Bill Reeves we wanted to showcase, and we had motion blur. This was one of the most revolutionary things that Pixar came up with. You actually blur characters out in the direction of motion during a frame. It made the difference between being commercially successful and not. We showed up with it, and the house went absolutely nuts.
The fact that I was animating, just using my knowledge of animation principles, it had this snappy quality.
And both visually and story-wise was a step above anything people had seen before.
And I remember this guy, he came up to me and he said, John, what software did you use to animate Andre and Wally-B? I said, it was just, you know, a keyframe animation system, pretty much like other systems I've seen. He goes, no, it was so funny. What software did you use?
Andre and Wally-B was proof that, yes, you could use this medium to tell a story. It wasn't much of a story, but you know, there it was, it worked.
But we didn't finish it in time for SIGGRAPH. So it was partly rendered, and then part of it was in wireframe. What I found was that most people didn't notice that we hadn't finished the film. They were so caught up in the characters that they didn't notice that it switched to wireframe.
When I first came to Lucasfilm to work with a computer graphics group, I thought I was going to need to learn how to program to be able to animate.
There were no off-the-shelf software packages. There were no easy-to-use techniques.
I realized, you know what? I'm never going to know what Eben Osby or Bill Reeves or Ed Catmull knows because they're PhDs. They've invented this stuff. Then I thought, well, wait a minute. They can't bring something to life through pure movement and give it personality like I can. So you know what? I'm just going to sit right next to them and work in collaboration.
It was actually a really great environment because, you know, we could just yell across the room at each other when we had a problem or question.
John and Bill and Eben were constantly pushing each other to do better.
I would always come up with an idea and show it to them. Can we do this? And I don't know if we can. Let me think about it. And they go off and they start working on it, doing a little R&D, and I'd look over their shoulder and I'd see something. And they say, oh, that's a mistake. I said, that's amazing. You know, can you do that again? Oh, yeah, because then you could do this. And I draw something else, and it's, how about this? Oh, and it's an idea I would have never thought of if I hadn't seen the technology.
It was this great back and forth. I always felt like the other half of John's ability to make films. We could do what he couldn't.
Art challenges technology, and technology inspires the art. You know, and that's it, in a nutshell, the way we work at Pixar.
The early years were hard years. We were selling hardware.
We've shown you just a few examples of the applications waiting to be explored with the Pixar image computer.
And then we sold software. In the background, we had a group that kept on making animated shorts.
It was something Ed Catmull really loved, but still it was not our business.
I went to John and said, can we do an animated short that's a Pixar short?
Let's do something that really says who we are. Eben Osby and Bill Reeves were teaching me how to use the modeling system. And there was a Luxo lamp sitting there on my drawing table.
The model itself was the world's simplest hierarchy. It was a base, and then an arm, and then another arm, and then a head.
And I started animating it as though it was alive and thinking about, okay, if a Luxo lamp was alive, how would it move around?
You could see him connect with that and saying, oh, I see how this thing works.
And I know one thing I was working on was the shadowing algorithm.
Self-shadowing was the lamp turning around and casting shadows on itself.
And what would be a cooler way to show off this technology than having the moving light sources be these lamps moving around so the shadows changed position all the time?
Then the fateful day that Tom Porter came into the graphics room with Spencer, his son. His proportions were totally different than that of an adult. The head was so big, and lift up the arm, and I could barely reach the top of his head, and I started thinking, what would a baby lamp look like? And in the computer, I was able to scale different parts of the lamp differently. We didn't have the computer power to do camera moves. We didn't have the computer power to do background. So I was like, how about a wood grain on the floor? We have that, right? Yeah, okay. I can work with this.
John had a very clear idea of what the limitations of the medium were, and so he told a story that he could tell in that medium and not have to invent stuff that was impossible to invent at the time.
And we premiered it at SIGGRAPH.
As soon as the lamp moved, people started going crazy. And then the ball came in, and they were going nuts. And I remember actually shrinking down in my chair, getting a little frightened, thinking, what's going to happen when the funny part gets here?
It's only a minute and a half long. Before it was done, people were giving it a standing ovation.
Poor Gary Rydstrom, his wonderful sound work was never heard at that screening because the crowd was just literally screaming their heads off.
And people were just talking about it forever as the first time they'd seen it. And the it that they had seen was the first time they'd seen emotion and character and storytelling in a computer animated film.
There's curiosity, there's dismay, there's sympathy, there's bemusement, a whole range of things that he was able to get through to the audience using just a few joint angles in this thing.
You realize that, okay, it's no longer a test if it's actually touching you in some way.
They laugh, they cry, they go out singing the songs.
And I'll never forget Jim Blinn, one of the giants in the computer graphics research world, came to me after the show. And he said, John, I have a question for you. And I thought, oh no, Jim Blinn, he's going to ask me about the self-shadowing algorithm. I know he is. I don't know that. He goes, John, was the parent lamp a mother or a father? And I just smiled, and I thought, we did it. We did it. You know, it's about the characters.